Não deixe para amanhã o podcast que pode fazer a diferença para você hoje. Fique por dentro dos assuntos que vão transformar o futuro e já estão transformando o presente no podcast O Amanhã Hoje, com Ricardo Amorim, em parceria com a GWM. Descubra algumas das principais novidades em tecnologia, inovação e sustentabilidade nesse bate-papo com especialistas que trazem um olhar apurado sobre cada tema. Ouça agora o podcast O Amanhã Hoje, aqui no Spotify. Você que está ouvindo esse podcast, o que acha de uma empresa que sempre trabalha para trazer impacto positivo? Assim é o Google. Como? A Duda da Orbi é um exemplo disso. Ela usa a inteligência artificial para ajudar pessoas a recuperarem seus movimentos. É a tecnologia mais útil na vida das pessoas. E tem o Jefferson da Tributei, que usa inteligência artificial para facilitar o dia a dia das empresas. Eles e milhares de empreendedores geraram mais de 188 bilhões com as plataformas do Google. Tem que ser bom para todo mundo.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, at Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Kieran, here we are already at our last holiday summer season pod. And as we're not the sort of pod that just takes 2 weeks off, we've been hopefully entertaining our listeners with some content, as they say, while various people on the pod are on their holidays. We had a brilliant interview with Maheta Malango, the head of the PFA, last week, and we've got a really interesting interview this week, Kieran, with Neil Doncaster, who's the Chief Executive of the Scottish Professional Football League, and this is what he had to say in a wide-ranging chat. Neil, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to catch up with our annual chat. Although you always look slightly nervous, Neil. We're on your side. We're going to ask you good questions. Don't you worry.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. Can we start by reminding our listeners a little bit about yourself, and also how is it that in Scotland all the leagues are unified into one organisation?
Yeah, well, I was recruited by what was then the Scottish Premier League back in 2009. I'd been at Norwich City as CEO before that. And in 2009, the SPL were looking for a chief executive. I joined them. And that followed what had happened some years previously, where there'd been a breakaway by the SPL from the Scottish Football League, just in the same way as happened in England in 1992, but in Scotland it happened in 1998. So I was recruited by the top division. But then in 2013, we were able to re-merge the two leagues into one. So that's why we now have one Scottish Professional Football League responsible for all 42 senior professional clubs in Scotland.
Before we talk about football in Scotland, Neil, I'd like to talk a little bit about yourself at the moment. And let me stress, you don't have to answer this first question. So I was in Scotland last week.
You've got me worried now.
No, worry. I was in Edinburgh last week, and I bumped into quite a few Scottish fans. For the benefit of those Scottish fans I bumped into, Neil, are you able to publicly reveal what football team you do actually support?
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. I grew up on the terraces of Selhurst Park, along with you, Kevin. So that was where my first love was. Being brought up in Croydon in South London. That allegiance, I must confess, did change while I was at Norwich City. So when I joined them in 1997, you actually become an extreme fan as a CEO of a club, but same in the way you would as a manager, I guess, while you're there. And then when you move on, you become slightly tainted by the experience. You're not really a fan in the same way after you've worked in professional football. So these days, I'm a fan of 42 SPFL clubs, but I think the Scottish national team is probably the one team, if you like, that I can get fully behind.
Yeah. I really like the first part of the answer to that question, Neil. I'm going to have the second part edited out, to be perfectly honest. It'll end with Crystal Palace, and it'll be me saying, well, of course you're an intelligent, good-looking man. Of course you're a Palace fan. You obviously spent a lot of time in Germany then, didn't you, for the Euros? It was a disappointing performance, but an uplifting tournament in many ways for Scotland, wasn't it, I suppose?
I think that's a very fair summary, Kevin. I think Brown Scotland, came out of the tournament very, very well. I think the reaction that Scotland fans got from the German public was incredibly positive, and I think the behaviour, the way in which Scottish fans was celebrating being back at a consecutive Euros finals was just a joy to behold. And I think those selling alcohol in Munich probably did particularly well out of it. It was a great experience, and it was just a shame that we couldn't qualify beyond the group stage. But here's to next time.
Yeah. Also, I like the way that Scottish fans, maybe not to the extent that Japanese fans do, but Scottish fans tend to clear up after themselves as well. There's a sense of responsibility to the area that they're drinking in.
I think there's a real pride in representing the country, and I think that the comparison is fair in terms of maybe the New Zealand rugby team, cleaning the sheds. I think there is a genuine pride in representing the country overseas by the Tartan Army, and it was great to see. Fantastic behaviour, a great spirit. I felt absolutely safe walking around the city centres in Cologne, Munich, Stuttgart. It was great.
Yeah. One more question about you, Neil. You've been elected to the board of European leagues. Tell us a little bit about that and how it may benefit Scottish football.
Yeah, it's my second stint on the European Leagues board. It's the organisation that represents the interests of professional leagues across the whole of Europe. And the European Leagues recently joined forces with the World Players Union, FIFPro, to make a complaint to the European Commission about FIFA and its conduct in relation to the international match calendar, which is currently making fixture congestion across the world, but in our case, across Europe, worse and worse. So the European Leagues does have an important part to play in this area, and I'm very pleased that action is now being taken to tackle the issue, which really affects the whole of the football ecosystem.
Various agencies, clubs are still championing a European Super League. Firstly, is that just talk, Neil, do you think, or is it a potential stick for the big clubs to beat UEFA with? And should it ever happen, and Kieran thinks it will, can you imagine Celtic and Rangers in a European Super League?
Well, I think making predictions in football is never a great idea. It's an ever-changing kaleidoscope, and it's hugely unpredictable. If you go back to the announcement of the establishment of the Super League back in 2021, it came completely out of the blue. So I do think it's entirely possible that the biggest clubs in Europe may wish to resurrect the monster that is the European Super League. But I think it's equally possible that the rest of football, indeed society, will once again unite to kill it off. And I certainly hope so.
Well, I hope so too, but I think there's been a sea change in the last year amongst football fans, Neil, in that there are now plenty, certainly in England, who are saying, well, if the top six or top seven, whoever they want to be, want to bugger off and have a European Super League, then by all means let them, and it will make things more competitive for the rest of us.
I think you need to be very careful what you wish for. I think the lure of the English Premier League, overseas in particular, is driven very much by the biggest names within it. And I think if you were to lose those biggest names, suddenly the EPL would not be anywhere near the product that it is at the moment. So my view is that we should do all that we can to resist any calls for some form of self-selecting breakaway. Football has to be on merit, has always been on merit, and it should remain so.
And presumably you feel that way about Celtic and Rangers. Should they be interested in taking part in the European Super League?
Well, it's not our issue. I don't see any of the sort of medium-sized leagues being, or the clubs in those leagues being courted by a European Super League anytime soon. I do think it's vitally important that all leagues unite to resist what I think is a pretty unsavoury structure. And if you look at the work that's been carried out between the ECA, European Clubs Association, and UEFA, and increasingly the European leagues, I think everyone's working together to maximise the commercial benefit of staying within the existing structures.
And there's been a lot of talk recently, Neil, about domestic games taking place overseas. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, took an incredible amount of flack last week after suggesting that the Spurs-Arsenal game should be played overseas in years to come, because that would only be fair on those global fans of those clubs. It didn't go down.
Nah.
It didn't go down very well. But you've got two clubs that are huge global brands. Could you ever imagine a Celtic Rangers game taking place in America, for example?
I think football is often criticised for not being open to change and for being inflexible and lacking in imagination when it comes to new ideas. So I think we should certainly be open-minded about any ideas, however superficially challenging they may be, rather than simply dismiss them out of hand. And for that reason, we will certainly be monitoring carefully the developments in this area. And if you look at a number of overseas leagues, they currently hold their Super Cups overseas, and that has proved to be quite a commercially successful initiative. But I do think that league games being played overseas is a particularly difficult concept. It's hard to see fans, particularly the home club, embracing the idea of games being played literally thousands of miles from their home. British football is not the Harlem Globetrotters, and for that reason, we will certainly not be in the vanguard of moves to take league matches overseas.
So I have a dream where Palace play Brighton in Milton Keynes. It's not an ambitious dream, Kieran, but I'll make it happen one day. Let's talk about two big recent deals for Scottish football. You've recently signed a new sponsorship deal with William Hill. And to outsiders, it seems to me that you're bucking the trend slightly by actually embracing gambling sponsorship. Have you had criticism about the new deal?
Well, there are certainly some people who simply oppose any form of gambling on principle. But gambling is undeniably a legitimate, lawful pastime. It's enjoyed by millions of people throughout the UK, and more than half of adults in Scotland enjoy a bet. According to the Gambling Commission, around half of 1%, so just 5 out of every 1,000 people who gamble, are problem gamblers. So it's important that this issue is addressed, and our partnership with William Hill has some very innovative elements to help that issue, which I'll come on to. But across the UK, gambling has always made a big financial contribution to football. And if you go back to the creation of the football pools back in the 1920s, Scotland's no different. So it's worth underlining the fact that football sponsorship is a fundamental and beneficial part of our game and its economy. In terms of the process that we went through, last summer we created a joint venture between the Scottish FA, the SPFL and the Scottish Women's Premier League to act as a one-stop shop for Scottish marketing inventory, and that was headed up by experienced commercial director Brendan Napier. So Brendan scoured the sponsorship market. He came back with 3 substantial, credible offers for our title sponsorship from this summer. All 3 were from betting companies. And what we had to do was to make a choice between those 3 offers. And we made our decision based on a number of factors, but chiefly around William Hill's approach to responsible gambling. It has a real commitment, William Hill, to being a proper partner for the SPFL. And part of that is a commitment to work with Epic Global Solutions, which is a leading provider of gambling harm prevention training and workshops. So Epic have launched a league-wide program on gambling harm awareness, which will see workshops offered to players at all 42 SPFL clubs. And in time, the program will, for the first time ever, be rolled out to fans as well. So those workshops are being paid for by William Hill as part of their commitment to responsible gambling. And I do think that demonstrates the wisdom of partnering with a responsible, credible, much-loved UK brand in William Hill.
I mean, that's all very good to hear, but it's there is criticism, isn't it? And it does seem across Europe, across the world, that the days of gambling sponsorship will be numbered, which is frustrating for people in football because not many other sponsors can afford the sort of money that you're looking for, as you say.
Well, if you look at the last 7 credible offers that we've considered for our title sponsorship over the years, of those 7, 6 were from betting companies. One was from a car company, and they chose to exercise a right to exit after 3 years. So I think that gives you an indication of the importance of gambling companies to the economy of football, and you certainly see that importance reflected in the EFL. And I do think, as is the case with the Sky Bet deal with the EFL and our own deal with William Hill, it's about focusing on responsible gambling, and I'm confident that William Hill do that.
And I'm guessing, Neil, that when it comes to the sponsorship of an entire league, you're going to be taking much more effort to do proper checks than maybe a club would when they're approached by a Southeast Asian white label gambling company waving a massive cheque in front of them.
Yeah, I think that is the case, Kevin. This is a record deal for us. It will bring in an 8-figure sum over the next 5 years, and a time when the cost of living crisis continues to create financial headwinds for our 42 member clubs. The more income we can bring into the league, the stronger our clubs will be. So whilst for our very biggest clubs, the money that they receive from the SPFL represents maybe just a few % of their overall income, for most of our clubs, SPFL fees are an extremely important source of revenue. And for some clubs, it makes up around half of their total income. So that's important. It is that we maximise central sponsorship, we maximise broadcasting, we maximise licensing income for the benefit of all of our clubs. And unusually, 100% of the fees that we pay to clubs are paid out according to where clubs finish in the league. So when league income increases, all 42 clubs benefit.
Well, I'm going to bring Kieran in here, Neil, because he's nodding away vigorously in the background. I recognise Kieran's vigorous nod when I see it. I'm assuming, Kieran, that's a financial model of distribution you approve of.
Every model has pluses and minuses, so there's no one perfect model. What we've seen south of the border, and also in UEFA's distribution models, is a scenario which is geared towards those clubs that deliver in terms of viewing figures. Those clubs also, who, it has to be said, have extracted concessions from UEFA and the Premier League by threatening to set up alternative competitions if they've not got their own way. So yeah, I like the idea of the Scottish model. From my point of view, it's much simpler when I'm designing my spreadsheet, which has to be taken into account. That's a marriage saving benefit, which I don't necessarily get from UEFA's model or that of the Premier League. So yeah, it's nice and simple. Everybody knows that every match matters. So yeah, if you're in the Scottish Second Division and you've got 3 matches to go, well, the difference between finishing 8th and finishing 4th still matters because it hits the coffers of the club. So I think it's nice and simple and it works for everyone.
Neil, I can only apologise. I've never worked with anyone who is more able to turn the subject of a conversation around to spreadsheets than Kieran Maguire. They're happily talking about Scottish football and suddenly it's spreadsheets. Your TV deal with Sky has been extended. Neil, tell us about that.
Yeah, delighted to be extending the scope of the deal with Sky Sports. Fans of Scottish football have been crying out for more coverage of William Hill Premiership matches on TV, which up until this summer saw Sky Sports with the rights to up to 48 games per season. This summer, we were able to work with Sky to agree an additional 20 games live on Sky Sports, but we also agreed a package of another 20 games live on Premier Sports. So we'll go up to 80 William Hill Premiership games shown live on TV this season, plus playoffs, which is the highest ever number in Scottish football. But we have resisted the temptation to make more top-tier games available at this stage. It's important to remember that the SPFL is the best attended league per head of the population anywhere in Europe by a mile. And a huge part of that is the passion that Scotland has for football, but it's also down to the fact that we recognise that attendance within the stadium is at least as important as being able to watch the game live on TV. So that's the reason why we'll be making up to 80 of our 228 William Hill Premiership matches available on Sky Sports and Premier Sports. But for the remaining 148 or thereabouts, to see the game live, you've got to be there. So it's no coincidence that last weekend we had 4 William Hill Premiership games live on TV, live on Sky, plus Falkirk against Queen's Park in the William Hill Championship live on BBC Scotland. and all 5 games were home sellouts. So we had 5 fantastic matches for those who were lucky enough to be there, but also for the millions who were watching worldwide. So that's the league. And then in the League Cup, we've been able to work with Premier Sports to make available a number of further games as part of an OTT streaming service. And that's been very well received by fans. So I think it has been a very successful summer commercially. And that's going to enable us to build on the record-breaking turnover, club fees and cup prize money that we announced last season.
And is this a considerably better deal financially as well?
Yeah, I mean, it'll certainly add to the bottom line. And ultimately, given the percentage of clubs' income that comes from the league, as I've said already, it's vitally important that we maximise club fees and that all 42 clubs benefit.
Não deixe para amanhã o podcast que pode fazer a diferença para você hoje. Fique por dentro dos assuntos que vão transformar o futuro e já estão transformando o presente no podcast O Amanhã Hoje, com Ricardo Amorim, em parceria com a GWM. Descubra algumas das principais novidades em tecnologia, inovação e sustentabilidade nesse bate-papo com especialistas que trazem um olhar apurado sobre cada tema. Ouça agora o podcast O Amanhã Hoje, aqui no Spotify.
Talking of the number of games you're happy to televise, I'd be interested then to hear what you say about the EFL, who's starting from tonight. We're recording this on Friday, the first day of the EFL season. The sheer number of games that will be available to watch on TV down here, do you think that's a good thing? Because judging by what you just said about Scotland, you'd probably be reluctant to let that happen.
I think it's important that you speak from a position of understanding and experience, and I'm loath to offer leagues advice on their broadcasting arrangements because the circumstances are very different. In Scotland, I certainly don't foresee any time soon where we'll be making available so many of our games live on TV. I think it's vitally important that we protect attendances in stadia. There are some parts of Europe where their experience is that a game being live on TV doesn't hit the crowd. I think our experience in Britain is a bit different, and I think particularly away attendances, they are affected by games being live on TV. So I think that there's a sweet spot in terms of maximising commercial income through TV deals and getting the best of your games live on TV, but at the same time ensuring that it's still attractive to buy a season ticket and that people stay in the habit of turning up and watching, particularly 3 p.m. games on a Saturday. And I think that, that's clearly a risk whenever you start moving games lock, stock and barrel away from a slot that people have got used to, is that people can get out of the habit of going to games. And I think football in this country has recovered really fantastically well from COVID and an experience that broke their habits temporarily of going to games, particularly at 3 o'clock on a Saturday. And it has recovered very well, and people have come back in huge numbers. But clearly there are risks, and I'll be watching very carefully to see what happens with their ambitious experiment, the EFL's experiment, in terms of so many games being broadcast live this season.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Kieran and I grew up in a generation that was so paranoid about the effect live football would have on TV audiences that you weren't even allowed to announce what highlights would be on a Saturday night in case, if Palace Stoke if they said at 12 o'clock Palace Stoke's on Match of the Day tonight, they thought that people wouldn't turn up to Selhurst Park. Now it's interesting to hear that you don't think it has a significant effect.
Well, I think in certain parts of Europe, it's undoubtedly the case that games being live on TV doesn't appear to have an effect. But we certainly see an effect. I think across Britain, in terms of games being live on TV, you certainly see it midweek, and you certainly see it with away attendances, and that's why I think we should be cautious.
We now know, Neil, that the new government intends to continue with the process of appointing an independent regulator for English football. Would you like one for Scottish football?
In short, no. I think it's important, though, to recognise that what may be appropriate in one league may be entirely inappropriate in another. And I'm certainly not going to tell Richard Masters or Trevor Birch, what's best for the EPL or the EFL. I would absolutely urge huge caution when it comes to the concept of any independent football regulator, whatever jurisdiction that may be in. I regard the English FA as the regulator for the game in England, just as the Scottish FA is the regulator north of the border. And to impose a fresh level of hugely expensive bureaucracy, effectively an additional regulator, when finances are already stretched, seems to me to be a very questionable use of scarce resource. And it's also fair to say that regulators, whether for the water industry or the railways or whatever it may be, have not always been in the news for good reasons recently. So, but all that said, the context in England is very, very different from that in Scotland. In England, you had the UK government's football governance bill, which resulted from Tracy Crouch's 2021 review of the English game, and it was clearly a very thoroughly and well put together document without any doubt. And it followed a commitment in the Tory Party manifesto, I think, from 2019, and that followed the insolvency of Bolton Wanderers and Bury and the threat of the Super League. So that's an English context. The objectives for the English football regulator were three. One was club financial soundness. One was described as systematic financial resilience, so distribution of revenue throughout the pyramid. And the third was safeguarding of club heritage assets, such as shirt colours, club badges, club names, etc. And it's worth me spending just a couple of minutes to talk about each of those three objectives in a Scottish context. So if you look, first of all, at financial soundness, in English football, we've had the insolvency of Bury, Bolton Wanderers, Wigan Athletic, Derby County, all have gone bust within the last 5 years. And over the same period, not a single SPFL club has gone into administration. Indeed, you've got to go back over a decade for the last time that an SPFL club went bust. And since then, the SPFL has introduced new rules about payment of tax and player wages, and those give an early warning about clubs that might be getting themselves into financial trouble. So the second objective of the regulator is financial resilience, so distribution of revenue throughout the pyramid. In England, you've got Rick Parry, the EFL's chairman, has long argued that the top tier should give 25% of its broadcast revenue to the second, third and fourth tiers of the game to ensure a healthy and strong pyramid. And it might surprise your listeners to learn that within the SPFL, we already distribute between 20 and 25% of our total funds to the second, third and fourth tiers of Scottish football, with further payments to the clubs in the leagues below. So in the League Cup, we've been able to increase distributions to clubs by 414%, believe it or not, since the creation of the SPFL in 2013. And every single SPFL club and a number of Highland and Lowland League clubs benefit from that success every season. So when it comes to the third objective, safeguarding of club heritage, the Scottish FA has already embraced the need to do exactly this. So their article, I think it's 10.7, requires SFA board consent to a change of ground, and further changes were approved this summer at the Scottish FA AGM when a new rule was introduced requiring that any changes to club crests and colours needed to be approved by the Scottish FA, and clubs will need to prove that their fans support those changes before they'll be allowed. So in short, no, I don't support the creation of an independent football regulator in Scotland. I think it's an English solution to an English problem, and it was one that was developed by Boris Johnson's government, and one which is neither required nor welcome in Scottish football.
Yeah, it's a discussion for another pod, but I would argue that what the water industry needs is more regulation, not less, to be perfectly honest. But that's a very thorough answer you gave us there. And I suspect the words Boris Johnson are one of the reasons why a lot of people in Scotland are against the idea of a regulator anyway. But are there any people in Scottish... are there people in Scottish football who are for the idea of a regulator? Do any of the clubs want it, any of the club owners?
I'm not aware of any club that is in favour of the introduction of a Scottish football regulator. And I think even those people that across Scotland may favour the idea in principle, when you're confronted the reality of the cost that it would undoubtedly create, I think even they would think again. I mean, in England, you're looking at a cost of maybe over 10 million. In the context of Scotland, where we have just 14 staff in the SPFL and just 5 in the Scottish Women's Premier League, that sort of expenditure simply couldn't be justified. I think it's very, very difficult.
And does the lack of desire for a regulator in Scotland mean that most people are happy with the way money is distributed in Scottish football?
The only certainty about money, and I think this is a truism the world over, is it's never enough. Clubs are always demanding more. But our track record, particularly since re-merging the leagues in 2013, has been to continually grow club fees, grow prize money in the League Cup and the Challenge Cup, and distributions overall. We've got a very ambitious target to get to 50 million per year in distributions across the 42 clubs. We will get there, and the initiatives this summer have certainly taken us closer to that target.
You recently decided to ban artificial pitches in a top flight. I say you, it was the clubs who decided to do it, but you'll get the blame. What was the reasoning behind it, and what's been the response to it?
Yeah, so you're right. The clubs in the top tier voted almost unanimously to ban artificial surfaces in the top tier in Scotland. Ultimately, that won't come into effect until summer 2026, so there is a period to allow clubs to adjust. And I think it was a number of factors. Fans, particularly of clubs that have a traditional grass pitch, don't particularly like the artificial pitches. They don't always show up on live broadcast as well as a grass pitch. And they do play differently. I think, unfortunately, there are a number of very good artificial pitches in Scotland. If you look at the surface at, say, Airdrie or Falkirk, they're very high quality. And unfortunately, some of the pitches that we've seen on television in particular in Scotland have not been quite of that standard. And I think that's, unfortunately, tied everyone with the same brush. But ultimately, this is the will of the clubs. And as you know, leagues are there to carry out the will of the clubs. And the Premiership clubs have spoken very clearly that for the top tier, and elsewhere it's fine, but for the top tier of Scottish football, artificial surfaces will be outlawed from 2026.
Obviously, there's a financial impact on those clubs with artificial pitches. It's not just the cost of ripping them up and relaying a grass pitch. It's the fact that they tend to be used by clubs with smaller incomes, and artificial pitches can help with that. So what will the SPFL be doing to alleviate that financial impact?
Well, you could make the same argument that those clubs with grass pitches invest in that infrastructure. And by allowing clubs to have artificial pitches in the top tier, you're effectively giving them an economic advantage over clubs that have to invest more in a grass pitch. So I think it's important that ultimately, whilst on paper I'm in charge, the league's in charge of 42 clubs, the reality is we are there to carry out the will of the 42 clubs. And the Premiership clubs are very clear that for the good of the game, they want there to be grass pitches only in the top tier. And there is a push towards ensuring that we have better facilities across the game, and that's being led by the Scottish FA. And in our case, the desire from the top tier is to have grass pitches. So I think we do need to look at the finances overall. But as I said, all 42 clubs benefit from all commercial deals that are brought into the league.
Can I just clarify two things about voting, Neil? First of all, this artificial pitch vote was only the Premier League clubs that voted on this? Yes,
so the top tier, on a divisional vote, so something that's affecting only the clubs in that division, then yes, it's a divisional vote that's required.
And when there's a vote that affects all 42 clubs, Elgin City or Peterhead, for example, would have exactly the same voting power as Celtic or Hearts?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. So if for example, there's a move to change the articles or change the commercial rules within the league, then that requires a much higher majority than other votes. So that would require 11 out of 12 in the top tier. 75% of the Premiership and Championship combined to vote in favour, and 75% of all 42 clubs to vote in favour. So that's a pretty high bar to get over. But it does mean that all clubs have a say on important matters that affect them. I think there's a lot of mythology around this high voting threshold that Rangers and Celtic continually use that mechanism to block change. The reality is I've been there 15 years and I've never seen Celtic and Rangers combine to use their voting power to block that majority from going through. It's we last had a vote on league structure. I think it was a number of years ago, and it was to move to a 14-team league. And ultimately, it was two other clubs in the top tier who voted against it and stopped it from moving forward. So, whilst the perception is that that's a structure that protects Celtic and Rangers, the reality is actually it's not. It's a higher voting threshold that's required when you're talking about anything that goes to the very root of the competition. So, an article change or a change to the commercial rules.
We've got a question from listeners about league size coming up, but you kicked off last week. Sorry, Scottish football kicked off last. I can't imagine you kicking off, Neil.
That wouldn't be a good spectacle.
No, it wouldn't. Scottish football kicked off last week. What are the biggest challenges you face in the season ahead?
The beauty of Scottish football, indeed all football, is that you never quite know what's around the corner. You never know quite what a season has in store for you. I think this season, clearly, Ibrox being out of action for the start of the season has added a level of complexity to what is already a hugely congested fixture calendar. Last season, we saw a number of games being postponed due to inclement weather and issues with pitches. And whilst we can't predict quite what meteorological challenges we may face this season in Scotland, it's a fair bet that it might be raining at some point north of the border this year. So, look, beyond that, football never fails to surprise. So next summer, when we look back on this season, I hope we'll have a huge amount of positive stories to talk about. But I suspect that we'll also be talking about various pretty random and unpredictable challenges that have arisen over the year.
Could you just clarify that Ibrox situation for us, Neil? Because there are rumours that they may have to move into Hampden Park for some parts of the season. Is that true? And would that then have a knock-on effect on the national team?
Well, it's certainly the case that Rangers have agreed a deal with the Scottish FA, who are the owners of Hampden Park, to use Hampden for the start of the season. And I'm pleased that alongside the Scottish FA and Queen's Park, who use Hampden, we've been able to make Hampden Park available as an interim measure to ensure that Rangers home games don't need to be played away from Glasgow. So it's important that wherever we can that we help our member clubs, as long as we don't create problems for our other clubs. It's always important that we help the members. And I think it's a very good indication of the close and positive working relationship that exists between the league, the Scottish FA and Rangers under Chairman John Bennett, that we've been able to find and facilitate a solution that works for everyone.
And what is the issue with Ibrox? Sorry, are they doing building work there, or?
Yep, they've had some work going on over the summer to one of their stands, and I believe that there's some delays in terms of materials arriving in Glasgow. But the detail of that, fortunately, is not part of my brief. We're here to help find a solution, and I'm pleased that we've been able to be part of a solution.
Yeah. I want to end the interview, Neil. You kindly agreed to answer readers' questions, which I was surprised about a little bit. But I've picked 3 because they represent a range of issues across Scottish football. And the first question comes from Tommy Miller. And he's gone into great detail about this, but essentially Tommy wants to know when the SPFL are going to implement UEFA guidance on colour blindness kit protocol. He uses Aberdeen v Airdrie as an example of how difficult it is for the 1 in 12 males and 1 in 200 females who suffer from colour blindness, and says he's becoming increasingly fed up season after season. It seems that there's a simple answer to this. He says make sure teams have 3 kits, one of which is light coloured, one dark coloured and one neutral. But you are, as he says, disadvantaging more than 8% of your male viewing public here.
I've got to confess, Kevin, that when I came on here today, I expected a number of questions, but probably colour blindness wasn't one that I anticipated. But look, it is an important issue, and as Tommy points out, colour blindness is remarkably common. And I can report that one of my team, Liam McNally, he sits on a colour blindness in football working group alongside the other British leagues. So the objective of that group is to streamline different rules and different approaches to colour blindness, which are currently taken across Britain, particularly when it comes to the colour contrasts of club kits. So I'm hopeful that what will emerge from the work of that group will be a shared colour blindness awareness document, which will provide guidance to clubs when designing and selecting kits in the context of colour blindness. So a work in progress.
Kieran, obviously I have to bring you in here. Are there games you watch on TV in particular where you just think, I'll give up after 5 minutes, where you don't carry on watching?
Yes. I mean, the classic example is normally actually, ironically, when I'm watching rugby, because Wales versus Ireland for a colourblind person is just a non-starter. So, yeah, look, I'm a football fan. I'll watch two flies playing football if there's a ball in between them, and it's just for me it's just a frustration for anybody that's colourblind. We're acknowledged it's not a disability; it's an inconvenience. It's not ideal for football. It's not ideal if you're a passenger in a car when I'm driving, being red-green colourblind. But yeah, it's part of the risk that you take, and it's part of the enjoyment of the game. I think there are simple solutions to it. But at the same time, there are other stakeholders in the game, such as the kit manufacturers, such as the clubs themselves, who are trying to maximise revenues from the sale of merchandise, and that includes kit. And because football kits have gone beyond the football fraternity, it is now leisure wear. I was up in London a couple of days ago, and I was amazed at the number of people who didn't look like, didn't look like traditional football fans who were wearing kits of clubs from all over the world. And if I'd been asked to answer what colour are those, I would have struggled to come up with a correct answer. But they are fashion items as well. So there's a compromise for everybody. And I think having a light or dark option can be beneficial. But if your home kit's light already, then that doesn't even have to impact upon all clubs.
Every cloud has a silver lining, Kieran. If it's colour blindness stops you watching rugby, embrace it. Joe Conway has a question, Neil, for you, which involves an issue we discussed on the pod recently, which was the issues that Livingston had with the South African player Tete. And Joe would like to know what policies and involvement the SPFL have in helping and advising clubs when they look to sign players from outside Europe when it comes to contract issues and work permits.
Yeah, it's a good question, but I'm sure that Joe will understand that what I can't do is comment on an individual work permit application, but I can certainly talk about how they're dealt with in general. So our clubs are subject to the UK government's governing body endorsement scheme, and that allows the Scottish FA to issue work permits to players from overseas. And for those players who don't have sufficient points under that scheme, there is the opportunity for clubs to apply to what is called an exceptions panel that the Scottish FA convene, and that gives the Scottish FA discretion to allow a work permit to players where there's a compelling case for them to receive one, but they don't have sufficient points. And ultimately, it's for a club to make its case and convince that panel that the player should be given a permit. And that will always be a subjective judgment, and clearly not all applications will succeed.
Our final question for you, Neil, from listeners comes from Kieran Hennigan from the Improving Scottish Football podcast. And it's quite an impassioned plea, this one. But the thing is, he said most fans would like the Scottish Premier League to increase to 14 or 16 teams. This would make the games less repetitive and boring and could help secure a better TV deal, as happened in Belgium, says Kieran. Is there any chance that you will begin a meaningful dialogue with fans and clubs to find an improvement to the league structure. And I suppose to many fans outside Scotland, Kieran, Neil, what you hear from Scottish fans is that much as I love Brighton Palace games, I don't really want to play them more than twice a season, to be perfectly honest. And that does seem to be a criticism or a comment, if you want, that you do hear from Scottish fans. So is there any chance that the league structure could be changed?
Ultimately, again, we're here to serve the clubs, and if the clubs vote if they want a change, then that gets delivered. But there's a reason why we've got a 12-10-10-10 structure. So when I first got involved in the game back in the early 1990s, I was told by someone much older and much wiser than me that the perfect league format is simply never the current one. There's always something better just around the corner. But I do think that our 12-team league has stood the test of time since its introduction over 20 years ago. So we have a split after game 33, which creates 5 rounds of extremely competitive matches at the end of each season, and that gives us 38 fixture rounds in total. And it's interesting to me that the Swiss Super League recently voted to adopt our format. It's also a bit of a myth that leagues around Europe are generally much bigger than the SPFL. And in fact, many European countries have fewer than 16 teams in their top league, top divisions. Austria, Finland, Slovakia, Switzerland and Denmark all operate with 12 teams, as an example. And Denmark actually recently moved away from a 14-team format to adopt the SPFL format. So I do accept that there are other formats that are possible, but it's also the case that each of those systems has its pros and its cons. So with a 16-team format, playing once home, once away, that would create only 30 fixture rounds rather than 38 that we have at the moment. And it would also lead to just 2 scheduled derby matches in each season, as we saw last weekend with the Dundee Tayside derby.
Yeah.
These are fantastic occasions, full of the noise, the colour, the passion, the drama and excitement that is the hallmark of the SPFL. So we should always be open to ideas about potential new formats, but we do need to be careful to ensure that any change actually takes the game forward. So, Scottish football moved to a format with smaller divisions in order to improve the number of meaningful competitive games, to drive greater attendances, and to create more entertainment and drama. And I think over the years, that's precisely what our current league format has done.
Interestingly, of course, Neil, as well, there are a number of bigger clubs in England who'd like to see the Premier League smaller.
Indeed. There is no perfect format, but we do have the highest attendance per head of the population anywhere in Europe for a reason, and it is that passion, that drama, that excitement, where every game matters, and effectively, the post-split games are effectively playoff games at the end of the season, against teams in your half of the table. Those are very, very intensely competitive games, and they do drive attendances, whether it's on TV, whether it's in the stadium, and that helps to fuel the clubs commercially in Scotland. So let's be open-minded about change, but let's be clear what the pros and cons of any such change might be.
I asked about your biggest challenges in the season ahead, Neil, so I think it's only fair to end the interview by asking what your biggest hopes are for Scottish football this coming season. What are you most looking forward to?
Well, we had some really good performances in Europe this week with Rangers, St Mirren, Killie, all getting very creditable draws. So, look, at the moment, I know before this pod goes out, but looking forward to next week, we certainly wish those clubs well. Really important for the coefficient for Scotland that our clubs do well in European competition. And I'm very hopeful with the new league phase format that is being brought into the Champions League this year, that our clubs will do well. So that's certainly my hope.
Neil, it's been a pleasure talking to you as ever. I look forward to our next annual catch-up in 2025. And in the meantime, I wish you all the best for this season with Scottish football.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Kieran, Neil's always very good value, because there's an element of treading on eggshells with every question he answers. and of course we won't ask him about specific clubs because it wouldn't be right for him to comment. But he's always really interesting. It's always really interesting to talk to somebody who runs. I remember my mate Roy, who ran a little five-a-side league, and my mate Harry, who runs a quiz team, and it's chaos. You've got no guarantee you're getting through to the end of the fixture list because it's quite complicated. To speak to a grown-up who's in charge of the football in a country that loves football is always interesting. But I was particularly interested in three things, Kieran. What you had to say about the regulator, that it's specifically very much an English solution to an English problem.
Yes, and I think Neil's absolutely right to say that there's no necessity in Scotland. I think there is a different issue up there. I also think, sort of linked to that, the fact that Scottish football has come together, and now that there is one product, is there a case for saying that perhaps if the English football clubs don't want a regulator, then we should go back to having a body which looks after all 92 clubs as opposed to a breakaway league and the EFL. And that would also address some of the other issues which Neil raised in terms of his concerns. Was there would be an administrative stroke bureaucracy related cost, which is effectively external to the game. Well, if you combined the Premier League and the EFL, and I'm not keen on job losses anyway, you know me, I'm sort of fairly old school with regards to that, but even through natural wastage, you could have some form of progress there. So the average cost per club could come down, and because you would have to take into account the interests of all 92 clubs, it could be that the independent regulator south of the border would naturally wither and die because it would have less and less to do.
Oh, that's a really good thought, Kieran. I wish it had been me that had thought of it and asked Neil about it. I thought he might get a bit defensive about the question about league size. But no, he was absolutely adamant. 14, 10, 10 is what they've got, and he thinks it's the best solution.
Yeah, they seem very happy in Scotland with regards to the current position. The playoffs effectively creates a league within a league, but getting into the top six, that creates, for match 33, you've still got something to play for. So I can see the conceptual benefits of having such an approach. And there are benefits also for other stakeholders within the game, because when I talk to broadcasters, and one of the constant gripes that Scottish fans have is, why is the level of broadcast deal in Scotland so low compared to that of England? Ultimately, it comes down to eyeballs, and who do the eyeballs want to watch most of all? Well, it's the two big Glasgow clubs. And what are the matches they want to see most of all? It's the Glasgow derby. And the way that the system currently operates is that you get an additional Glasgow derby, which means that you get greater viewing figures from the broadcaster. Therefore, the broadcaster is willing to pay more money, and we covered the issue of the broadcaster as well, and they seem happy with the expanded deal in Scotland.
Well, they're not all happy with the structure up there, Kieran, which is why the Improving Scottish Football podcast asked me about it. The last thing as well, Kieran, and I could sense it wasn't reluctant. He was very happy with the question, and his answer was a very lengthy and elaborate one. But there is no doubt that Scottish football is bucking the trend a little bit when it comes to embracing sponsorship from gambling companies. And it's interesting to hear that you're literally left with no other choice. Like 6 out of the 7 initial sponsorship offers were from gambling companies, and then the 3 that were viable were all from gambling companies.
Yeah, comes down to demographics. Look at the demographic of people who attend football matches. And remember, the EFL are continuing with their relationship with Sky Bet. The Premier League is continuing to allow clubs to have gambling sponsors. It's just not on the front of shirt. And would the Premier League take sponsorship from a gambling body? The answer is yes, but the reason why the Premier League is no longer, it used to be sponsored by Canon and then Barclays and so on. The only reason why it doesn't get a sponsor is that the Premier League have done their sums and they realise that if you are sponsored by the likes of Barclays, then that's going to irritate Liverpool because they've got Standard Chartered, who are a rival bank. It's going to irritate Brighton because they've got Amex, who are seen as a rival bank. And you can end up potentially losing those sponsors. So the overall position is deemed to be cash negative. I know I get accused of being anti-gambling. I'm not anti-gambling. I just don't think the gambling industry does enough in terms of looking after those people who are disadvantaged because by the excesses of gambling. And in my view, it pays lip service to its responsibilities. It was encouraging to hear Neil's comments that there are going to be increased facilities, but I take the view that Pablo Escobar used to build hospitals in Medellin. Didn't make him a nice guy.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution as well, that'd be very kind of you. And that will get you access to our chat community and our regular quizzes. And you can do that by going to patreon.com/priceoffootball. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, and we'll be back next Tuesday with all our holidays will be over. We'll be back to questions pods. And you can email us at questions@priceoffootball.com if you do have a question. You can follow us on Twitter X. You can find us on our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to buy our book, a copy of which is coming out in paper, no more than a copy, some copies of which are coming out in paperback shortly, you can find details on our website, priceoffootball.com. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The Price of Football. The Price of Football.